Hi, my name's Chris. I'm pastor of the Word and the Way, a Messianic congregation in North Kansas City. This is our weekly message, which I usually come home and re-record. You can join us live through our YouTube channel, and you can join live through Zoom if you sign up for our email list, because kind of restrict the Zoom access to people who are real, not joining for nefarious purposes. And when we do these live, there's a lot more interaction. There's a lot of people who talk during the message, have questions, have discussion, because our assembly is set up more for first century Christianity, which was more of a bi-directional relationship rather than the top-down, minister knows everything uh, paradigm or structure of that Christianity took on once it became creedal. It's about the 300s AD. We've gone back to the original, where everybody has skin in the games, everybody talks, everybody discusses. It's a much more intimate setting. So I'd invite you to join us. If you're in the Kansas City metro, we're near Mackin Park in North Kansas City, and you can get the address on the website. This week was D-Day, was the 80th anniversary of the Allied invasion of Normandy, primarily the United States. And it was a very good opportunity to compare and contrast the United States with ancient Israel, because while people get carried away comparing the two sometimes, there are parallels between the two nations that are that you just can't miss. They're unmistakable. They're really astonishing how similar the two countries were formed, and the foundations of the societies. And we also want to talk about how different we are today from when we liberated Europe, but also how similar we are, because some of those attributes are still present. One thing to note is that the last 80 years since the invasion of Europe have been the most documented of any decades, any period of time in the history of the world. The Roman Empire had a lot of documentation. The Greeks had a little. We have some stuff from Persia, but usually the archaeologists get excited when they find, like a tablet that has etchings from a period of time. Israel has heavy documentation. I would say that's probably second, is the nation of ancient Israel, all the way up through the first century, of having the documented Bible and the documentation of the formation of the nation, its purpose, its tenets, its Torah, the commandments, and then the commentaries on it, and as it evolved, and then ultimately was dispensed in 70 AD. And we have the library at Qumran. There was a library at Alexandria that got burned to the ground. So there is a lot of documentation in history, but the last 80 years has been enormous. One is because General Eisenhower, when they discovered what the Nazis were doing to the Jewish people with the concentration camps, he brought in all the media. He said, this has to be recorded. It has to be filmed. Nobody would ever believe the atrocities if they didn't get it on film, which is why if you turn on the History Channel, it covers a lot of World War II, because that's where we have just an enormous amount of media. And out here today, you could see, as I'm recording this to be broadcast across the world through the various media, that's just a very common occurrence that people do today, just sitting in their cars. If they feel like venting, they can end up with 1 million hits on a video. And the documentation is important because it's going to show how remarkably different our society became in a very short amount of time. With Israel, it was over a long period of time, and the story is always the same story. It says, okay, you guys, 70 people go into Egypt, a nation comes out. Yahweh says, okay, follow me and only me. Okay, no false gods. They turn around, not 20 years later, they're following false gods. He smites them. They come back. They do it again over and over and over until you get to the 1st century AD, where they're done with false god worship, and they're looking for a deliverer, and they got one that they weren't expecting. So we have a really big change in the 1st century AD, which is the name of this ministry, is firstcenturychristianity.net. But Israel, its history was pretty cyclical. Do what you're told. They don't do what they're told. They get smote. They get restored, and it goes on and on and on. So now we're going to start with our compare and contrast of military service of the nation of Israel versus or compared to the United States. In Numbers 26:51, it says, those who were numbered of the sons of Israel, 601,730. Now, most of the time the Bible says sons of Israel, it means children. It means men and women. In this case, it really just means men. And very narrowly, war-aged fighting men who are eligible to go to war. So it excludes the Levites. They were not numbered in the military. And the reason this is important, reason the census is so important to ancient Israel, is this is their military. This is how powerful a nation was how many people it could muster to go to arms. Israel did not have a standing army. They had to use all the able-bodied men. When it came time for battle, the able-bodied men had to go to war. So they have 601,730 war fighters in the desert, fixing to cross the Jordan and take the place by storm. And one place it's even written that, look how many of them there are. They will lick up our land. They will just completely take over everything, because they had no home base to defend. And even when they did get the little bit of land across the Jordan, they left the women over there alone, and the men had to go and fight. So that's very, very interesting contrast, because the United States was set up the same exact way. Even though we threw off the British, the largest army that had ever been deployed in the history of mankind in the 1700s was the British Empire. And they had conquered and controlled everything from India to Europe to North America to Australia to Canada. I mean, Canada's North America. And they were deployed everywhere, which is kind of why we won. But we won with all the able-bodied men standing up to the enormous army. So we were set up exactly like Israel in 1776 and thereafter, after we won our independence, 1780s, that each state was kind of like a tribe. And there were even 13 of them. It's very similar, okay? And the states had their own militias that they could call up, and war-fighting men were anybody 18 and up. I don't know if I can't remember if there's a top line on that off the top of my head. And I have the Constitution right there on my wall that you can't see because I have a fake background up. And so the United States was set up to not have a large standing army. Very, very similar to Israel. And Israel was prevented from having a census whenever they felt like it. They could only have it at specific times when Yahweh said it, because the kings and the nation would get cocky and they would think that they could take people, because he didn't want them to go to war with just anybody. When they did go to war, he oftentimes wanted them to win as an underdog. So even though they had 600,000 troops, sometimes he would send 20,000 to go defeat 100,000. In the Bible, it says that one man will send 100 to flight, because Yahweh wanted the nations to know that he was the one in charge. Even though the men had to go and fight, Yahweh was still the one who was doing the fighting. This is something for us to wrestle with in our brain, because it's the intersection of free will and predestination. Yahweh predestines things and uses humans to bring them about, even in our own lives. We make decisions in real time, and then when we look back on our lives and we're like, oh, okay, yeah, Yahweh wanted me to move across the country and set up my family in Missouri instead of out west where we're from, and now I know why. So in the real time, I'm making the decision to, to marry who I marry, work where I work, live where I live. But then in hindsight, you can see that Yahweh used that. So there's an intersection here where a lot of times Christianity has got this far out notion that we're all robots and that we have no free will and that everything we do is predestined and we don't have any input. Oh, we do. We can choose to do our own thing and ignore Yahweh, or we could choose to do what he says. But this tangent is all comes off the fact that Israel was not to have a census because they were supposed to trust that Yahweh would go and fight for them, which is a little bit different than our nation. Our nation knew that there were going to be wars, but they chose to not have a large standing army for a reason that I'll get into here in this next slide. Deuteronomy 17:14-20. When you enter the land which Yahweh your Elohim gives you, and you possess it and live in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me, you shall surely set a king over you, whom Yahweh your Elohim chooses. One from among your countrymen you shall set as king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves, who is not your countryman. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since Yahweh has said to you, you shall never again return that way. He shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. Now it shall come about when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear Yahweh his Elohim by carefully observing all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or the left, so that he and his sons may continue long in his kingdom in the midst of Israel. And so the United States president, the United States wanted to make General Washington the king, because a king is a military leader. The chessboard reflects the reality of most of mankind, that everybody's protecting the king. The king is actually in charge of the military. He is the emissary, the chief representative of a nation to other nations. While he governs inside a nation, his chief job is to go to war and represent the nation at war and with international affairs. And they wanted to make General Washington our king, and he refused. And in fact, he refused to even run for re-election after being our first president, because he was not going to set the United States up to be the same as Europe and the same mistakes as Europe. They wanted power to transfer from one to the next. And they very quickly did have to deal with foreign entanglements. The United States Marines and the United States Navy were formed after we had a country. We defeated the British with the blessed assistance from the French. The French had the Navy. We didn't have a Navy. We had to borrow theirs. They had to come and help us. And that's another miracle, that we threw off the British Empire, which was an armada of ships, by using the French, who all had their own motives for wanting Britain to suffer losses. And so after we developed the country, then we had to start making our own ships out of our own wood, and they were better than the ships from Europe, which is intriguing. And then the Muslim terrorists in North Africa were kidnapping our people who were on trade missions. And the Navy had to go and field units to go rescue our people from these very wicked people who to have this to this day. There's Islamic piracy off the coast of Africa, and you can see it on the news, CNN, Fox, News Nation, whatever you want to watch. It's still a thing today. It's their culture that whatever comes within their purview, if you're not Islamic, they can just steal you, and you can take your stuff, and then you have to ransom them back. And if you are Islamic, sometimes they go to war with you or whatever. And that existed in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and we had to field a navy to go and deal with that. But the reason I bring that up is because we were not set up as a military power at all. We had a humongous ocean between us and anybody else. Everybody who lived over here was kind of got along as far as the states goes. The Native American, the atrocities that we committed to the Native Americans didn't happen for quite a while later. We didn't need a Navy for that, didn't need an army for that. And so the nation was set up with a king as a president, as somebody who wouldn't stay president and who wouldn't let the power go to his head. And he had to follow the Constitution to a T. And they are almost right out of the gate, the presidents had problems put before them that they were like, can I do this or do I have to go to Congress? And today, I'm getting off on tangents. Today, they don't go to Congress for much of anything at all. But the parallels between the United States and ancient Israel are pretty big. We threw off a humongous army and then committed to not having one. And that is what Moses is telling the people. You're not going to be like the Egyptians. Horses, talks about multiplying horses. Until even during World War II, horses were still used in battle. When the Allies broke through and got into Germany, they were still using horse-drawn carriages to move around munitions and stuff. And so the horses is a transportation, but it's also a military weapon. You can, in Kansas City, during the riots of the last couple of years, we didn't have riots because the Kansas City Police Department deployed the mounted patrol, which quells the problem. You can have a crowd of 100, 1,000 people, and you put 5 men on horse in that crowd, and they calm down because there's a 2,000-pound beast right there that could trample everybody if it wanted to. In war, the people could sit up on the horse and just stick all the foot soldiers and kill them. And so these horses, and they drew chariots to where they could have armament around the actual fighter. And so these are weapons of war that they were not permitted to have. The king, when Israel made a king, they were not allowed to multiply horses in order to have a large standing army. They were going to be a free country that was protected by God and live in peace without having to train for battle unless it was absolutely necessary. And the king having to write a copy of the Torah on a scroll in the presence of the Levites, which means that he must respect the Levites. The king was not above the Levites. He was under the Levites. He cannot have his heart lifted up above his countrymen. He can't be more special. He has to be a citizen king, a servant king, not a lorded over you king. And we were set up that way, and we have really, really gotten away from that in the United States. And so a lot of this chronicling these parallels is to show where we were set up like Israel, and both of us fell away for the bad. The king also had to be native born, could not be someone who bought citizenship or who converted. And we adopted that verbatim in this country. There's celebrities like Arnold Schwarzenegger and a couple others that people want to make president who cannot be president. They were not born in the United States. They became citizens later on, and they're forbidden from holding the office of president because they'd be in charge of the army. So this is a mechanism for Israel and for us to try and prevent spies and nefarious people from becoming in charge of our entire country. And we adopted that practice almost verbatim. The king was also not to multiply his wives. And you can see throughout history, that is the thing that brings the heavy hitter big leaders down. Time and time again, that brings them down. President Reagan had a second wife. He had a divorce, and that was a gasp. That was a hurdle he had to overcome when he won his elections. President Kennedy cheated on his wife while in the White House. President Clinton did the same thing. And you can see throughout our country today the incredible, horrific sins of the men who gain enormous power, and they use it to for their own lustful purposes. Getting a lot of wives for Samson, it was a woman who brought Samson down. It was women who brought down Solomon. It was women who brought down King David. You could see that this is actually a necessity in this case. Unfortunately, my PowerPoint has an automatic click feature going on today. So hopefully I can get through without having to click back too many times. Because like I said, I am re-recording this. And if you want to watch these live, you're welcome to join on Sabbath at 1 p.m. Central Time through YouTube, through Zoom, or in person in North Kansas City. So moving on to the next slide, which the computer was telling me I needed to do, but the thing, 1 Samuel 8, 6-7, but the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. The people were begging for a king. This is Israel, hundreds of years after Moses. And Samuel prayed to Yahweh. Yahweh said to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, they have rejected me from being king over them. Samuel was the prophet of the day, and he was the mediator between God and mankind in his day. And maybe he was taking it personally that they were asking for a king. Even though it was prophesied, Samuel was disappointed and Yahweh didn't want it. Now, this is another thing, overarching principle for Bible study that we have to get our minds around, is that even though Yahweh doesn't want things to happen and knows people are going to do it anyway, he lets it happen because good comes from the bad. We like to read the Bible and like to see a lot of black and white, like you're going to do it, they do it, boom, 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 all the blocks fit together. And it just doesn't work that way. There's an enormous amount of gray area. Even though Moses, we just read the prophecy that Moses said they were going to get a king. It's in the Torah. They're going to have a king. Yahweh ultimately didn't want them to have a king. Even though they had to have a king for the Messiah to be the descendant of that king. So you can see a lot of times in the Bible, two opposing things can be true at the same time, which is very difficult for us as Westerners who are raised up in a this or that fashion. We're raised up as thinking like computers, that this is an Eastern philosophy, not a Western philosophy. And there's a lot of things that we don't understand, even at the philosophical level. And this is the rejection is that they wanted to be like the other nations. This is Israel's big downfall, and the United States has this downfall as well. We are supposed to be the leaders. We are supposed to be the pioneers. We are supposed to be the ones who broke from Europe. Very frequently, our leaders look over at Europe and go, well, we need to do that. Europeans have these tiny diesel cars. We need to have them tiny diesel cars too. We need to do everything they do in Europe. No, we don't. We have our own continent. We have our own country. We have our own ways, and we're going to do things the way we're going to do things, not the way the nations do them. This jealousy, this trying to keep up with the Joneses or keeping up with the Canaani, is what Yahweh did not want Israel to do at all. Do not go the ways of the nations. Do not learn what they do. Don't worship their gods. Israel had their culture, and they were supposed to have their culture. They were not supposed to keep being jealous of the people around them. As the opposite was supposed to be true. The people around them were supposed to be jealous of them. So in this day and age, both things are true. The Europeans and the foreigners are very jealous of the wealth and prosperity of the United States. They want to come here, but at the same time, they also want to bring us down to their level. And we need to be careful not to do that. We have our 10 amendments that were like 10 commandments that we're supposed to adhere to. And when the United States adhered to its constitution, it was a very great nation. When it had great power, it didn't wield it all the time. And that's one of the changes we're going to talk about in subsequent slides. And the next slide here is the fall of David. 2 Samuel 11, 1-2. Then it happened in the spring, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David stayed at Jerusalem. Now, when evening came, David arose from his bed and walked around on the roof to the king's house. And from the roof, he saw a woman sunbathing, or woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful in appearance. So David already had hundreds of wives. Yahweh let him, he was, these powerful, virile men love the ladies. And King David was one of those. And he fell because of Bathsheba taking a bath on the top of her house. Now, a lot of people want to blame Bathsheba for getting naked in the sight of the king. Well, if the king had gone to battle, the king was the only able-bodied male in the country. He wasn't supposed to be there. And that was the beginning of his downfall. All the things we read before. He multiplied horses, had a standing army, and got too big for his britches. And he decided he was going to stay home in the lap of luxury while he sent his people off to fight the battles. Kings aren't supposed to do that. In fact, that's even the opposite of how King David became the king. If you think about it, when King Saul would not go fight against Goliath because he was chicken, King David showed up as a little kid, put on Saul's armor that was too big for him, and went out and showed everybody what real leadership looked like. So the original king didn't do his job, and David come up and showed him up. Now here's David, the second king, not doing his job. And it turned into a whole cascading series of negative events. Very similar to what happened in the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden, Eve looked at the tree and longed for it before she was tempted by Satan. She had a hankering for that forbidden fruit, and that opened the door to sin. And now this also is the intersection between free will and predestination, because Yahweh knew that the plan of salvation was established at the foundation of the world. Well, he established the plan of salvation at the foundation of the world before the fall. He knew they were going to fall. He sets all these things in motion and knows they're going to turn out poorly so that good things can come from them. David had to sin in order to be brought back down to his level, to be humbled. And he took his lickings, and the kid had to die, because you can't have the Messiah come from a line of that. And, everything turned out the way it did. But it's very interesting to see that how we look at things black and white is this is either good or it's bad. Yahweh doesn't quite look at things that way oftentimes. There's some things he doesn't tolerate at all, but he'll let them work their way out, like the idolatry. In fact, there's even sarcastic statements from Yahweh, like, oh, you think those idols are going to save you? Well, let's see them do it. He'll even mock them. He's letting people work to the futility of our minds so that things can be shown at the end of ages when the books are open. So, D-Day plus 80. Israel's example of military service. So this shows the landing at Normandy, and then it shows Afghanistan, and it shows Iraq, because there's a lot of stuff to talk about here. Remember I said that Yahweh gets upset about stuff even though he knows the stuff is going to happen, okay? He knew Israel was going to fall. He knew David was going to sin. He still gets upset about it. You still have to pay your sins. You still have to get forgiven. Things still have to go on. The United States was not supposed to have an enormous standing army or navy. And then we needed one. Then we needed an army and a navy that could fight, that could liberate Europe while fighting Tojo's Japan. We mobilized from being the 14th largest military on earth to putting hundreds of thousands of boots on the ground of Normandy while simultaneously battling Tojo in the Pacific in a very, very short amount of time. And then we couldn't put it away. See, the United States, after throwing off the British, put all the weapons away. After the Civil War, when we had our bloodiest war, 600,000 dead, when that was over, we had reconciliation and we put the guns away. There's a farm, Grant's Farm in St. Louis, Missouri. Ulysses S. Grant's home after the war is a fence, humongous fence over hundreds of acres that's made out of rifle barrels. He took all the rifles, took them apart, and used them to make a wrought iron fence. You could see it to this day. And you can go there and tour the place. It's actually a tourist attraction in St. Louis, Missouri. We took the stuff and we put it away. After World War I, we had to mobilize to liberate Europe. We came home and we put the stuff away. Our nation did not want to have a standing army, and it stayed true to its constitution until after World War II. World War II, we got airplanes, we got ships. The Queen Mary is a famous ship that you could tour that's in Long Beach right now. It's a British ship. It was the fastest in the water in those days, and it could cross the Atlantic in 4 days. It was a wonderful tool for the good guys to have because the U-boats and the torpedoes couldn't keep up with it. It was faster than everything. And we used that ship to bring all of our troops home after World War II. Unfortunately, by our deploying hundreds of thousands of people to Europe, showed that hundreds of thousands of people could show up over here without us knowing it. And we did leave a bad guy after World War II. After all of that death and devastation, we let the Soviet Union exist. We honored our treaties. Even though that nation was obviously going to become our enemy, we didn't go to war with them. That's the misnomer today. You all hear on the news people saying that these men who are getting off of these barges were going to fight for democracy or for freedom. That is not what they were fighting for. The United States is set up to where we cannot go to war unless it is declared by Congress with a clear declaration and a mission. And in December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor. And that then President Roosevelt went to Congress and got the declaration of war against the Japanese, which then caused the Germans and the Italians, the Axis powers, to declare war on us. We went to war to defeat Japan, Germany, and Italy. We did not go to war to prevent democracy. After we defeated those enemies and dismantled their army and killed their leadership, because that's what we were going to do if they didn't surrender without any conditions, then we left. There was no discussion of how we were going to leave them before time. After the mess, they did get freedom. They did get liberty because they learned their own lessons. But the people who were liberated by the Soviet Union did not get freedom or liberty. They got put behind an iron curtain of a dictatorship, and they were enslaved until Ronald Reagan defeated them 40 years later, 50 years later. So history is a kind of a complicated thing. Israel had a mission when they crossed the Jordan, which was to destroy the inhabitants of Canaan and then set up their land. They were not to make treaties. They were not to make deals. They had specific people and they were supposed to depose. They didn't quite do it. They did it mostly. They stayed to mission. The United States stayed to mission too, until we came home and realized, the world is an incredibly dangerous place. And we are tired of having to go to Europe every 20 years and liberate those people. Clearly, they can't run their own continent. And so we changed. And we changed without changing our Constitution. Today, our presidents can go wage war and start entire wars and get people deployed and get people in country, and then go to Congress and say, you better fund that or you're going to be ashamed of yourselves. That's not what FDR did. Even with our fleet sunk in the Pacific Ocean in Hawaii, and Hawaii on fire, he did not go to war until he got the declaration from Congress. We used to follow our own rules, and us, just like Israel, have stopped following our own rules, and that starts a downward slide. Some people may think that current events like this are not appropriate for the lectern, but you must remember that Yahweh raises up nations and destroys them. This continent was found when it was found on purpose. Our history is real and it's on purpose. The atrocities that our nation is guilty of and has atoned for are what they are. There is a Civil War cemetery at the end of my neighborhood, not 1 mile from my house. We paid for that slavery. We paid 600,000 dead men over slavery. We paid for our sins, and we continue to pay for our sins. The Spanish committed a complete genocide in Latin America. Those are bad things. We can't ignore the bad and the good. As my daughters are learning, the history of this continent in college right now, and they're asking questions, and I'm like, yes, you're right. I don't know why everybody is upset with the United States, and they give the Latin American, Spain, a complete pass. Spain was 100 times worse than anything the United States did. There are entire cities in South and Central America that are completely intact because the Spaniards went in and just massacred everybody. It's unbelievable, the death and destruction that mankind can deal upon itself and rationalize. Hitler took over Europe and tried to kill the entire Jewish people. And we had to go and undo that. And we lost a lot of people along the way. Now, would we have been able to do that or even had the mind to do that had we not committed the sins in the past? Life is a gray area, brothers and sisters. It's not always black and white. When you're on the battlefield, it's black and white. You either kill the enemy or you die. But when you start looking at the bigger and bigger picture and the decisions that men have to make in whether to go to war or not is a difficult problem. After World War II, we stopped winning wars. After World War II, we completely, and it's with justification, we came home after liberating Germany, and we could have gone to war in the Pacific and invaded Japan, but then we wouldn't have had enough men left to repopulate our entire our continent. I mean, the Japanese were incredibly brutal and dedicated warriors. Years after World War II was ended, the Japanese soldiers were still holding their positions on the islands in the Pacific and couldn't even be convinced otherwise. They couldn't be convinced to stop fighting. They would never give up their positions, even without orders. They would follow their last order to the death. It would have been a horrific amount of death had we gone toe-to-toe with that empire. And so the decision was made to use nuclear weapons. And the proof that we needed to use the nuclear weapon is because we had to use 2. They did not surrender after the first bomb. That is unbelievable how dedicated they were to their empire, to their empirical means. Batojo's Japan was defeated, and the surrender was signed on the deck of the USS Missouri while it was anchored in Tokyo, and with 250 Allied ships. And we won. And Japan today is a very peaceful and prosperous country that contributes to the good of mankind. They turned it around. Germany is also the most responsible country in Europe, most fiscally responsible, and both of these countries bring remarkable technological advancements for the better of mankind today. because we had complete victory. We stopped doing that with the Korean War. We started dividing up countries. We started surrendering. We gave Vietnam to communism. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990. And I guess you could call that my war because I was in 1991, but it was already over. Not really. We didn't go to Baghdad and depose the dictator. We got him pushed out of Kuwait and then set up this temporary stuff. When we stopped doing what was necessary to win wars, we've created a lot more sin and a lot more conflict. The same thing goes for Israel. Israel, if they had stayed true to their commission and they'd stayed true to the Torah, they would have had peace, and then other nations would have had peace as being their example. When the United States follows its charter and its conscience and finishes wars, fights them brutally and finishes them off, the world's a better place. We fought in Afghanistan for 20 years. One could make the case that we didn't need to go to war in Afghanistan at all. We just had to get the bad guys out and leave them alone. Leaving them alone after 20 years of false hope is another big sin that we have to wrestle with. All of our war fighters, all of the time and treasure, the people who have gone to war and killed a lot of bad guys in Iraq and Afghanistan, now have to go to bed at night wondering if it was even worth it at all. Because if you can go to war for 20 years and then stop without winning, then you didn't need to go in the first place. Israel's history was long and sordid. They had direct commandments from Yahweh and failed up to live to the basics. And we had a different path. There's good and bad at the same time, just like there always is in history. But this time, it's a global issue. It's a global issue. And the Messiah says, by the standard you measure, you will be measured. By the standard you judge, you will be judged. Everybody wants to read the first part of that verse and not the second. It says, judge not lest ye be judged. The next sentence, for in the way you judged, you will be judged. By your standard of measure, it will be measured unto you. If we can't follow our own rules, how can we expect others to follow rules? That hypocrisy is something the Messiah had an incredible antipathy for the Jewish leaders who would say one thing and do another, who would live in the lap of luxury while everybody else was out toiling, while King David was at the palace while his men were off at battle. Yeshua did not like that at all, and he's coming back to judge the living and the dead. June 6th was the 80th anniversary of the landing at Normandy, when the United States, Canada, Britain, and every able-bodied man in the free world could fight, went and did so. We then gave up our charter of not having a standing army because we couldn't. We were then vulnerable. But this year, June 6th, we went to war. Had pomp and circumstance, and our presidents go stand at Normandy and give speeches as if they could do what Franklin Delano Roosevelt did. Now, 40 years ago, Ronald Reagan stood there and gave that speech in Pontotoc. Everybody knows that Ronald Reagan could do what Franklin Delano Roosevelt did. Since Reagan, I don't think so. I don't think so at all. Our leaders have had the same problems of King David and King Solomon, where Bill Clinton fell to adultery while he was in the White House. So did JFK. George W. and Barack Obama were both family men. That was good. And then the last two presidents, oh boy, oh boy, what a terrible choice the country has to make. And it's difficult to measure when you're a Christian and you're voting on character. Very difficult decision we all have to make. Think about the effort it took to go do this war. You see, we always think about the war fighters. That's even what my pictures are. But Rosie the Riveter was real. The entire United States and Canada stopped everything to focus on the war effort. They went without food. They went without water. They went without resources. The car companies switched to making tanks. Singer showing companies switched to making pistols. Everybody went to support the war effort. 100%. No choice but victory. And the women gave up their men and didn't know when they were going to come home. Unlike today, they couldn't call them when they got back from the battlefield. That was new when I was in. I got out in the Navy in 1996, and we did have early satellite phones, cost an arm and a leg to use them, and you could talk to people from wherever you were in the world. It was very expensive. Today, these war fighters here in the color pictures, they could get back to base and have a Skype with their spouses and see the kids playing in the background after coming back from a firefight across the world. That's psychology that I could never deal with. And I think that's one of the reasons why our people lose it, because we get the real-time images all the time. Back then, the real newsreel back in World War II and even all the way into the 80s, the newsreel would come in and everybody would open it and watch and be happy to have news that was a month old, to hear what's going on the front lines. It's very difficult to do it in real time. In Israel, those two tribes that had to leave their women and children on the other side of the Jordan, very similar. They didn't know what was going to happen until people came home. Focusing on the men who landed is proper and noble, but these military operations involve a lot more than that. Ships and equipment had to be built, food had to be prepared and supplied and preserved on an ongoing basis to feed these supply lines. And this is across the ocean. Across the ocean, we had to just continually flood the place with diesel fuel, gasoline, tires, ammunition, food. The entire West was completely in unity for victory. Do we have that anymore? Today, as I'm speaking, there are people protesting Israel's operation to return their hostages. There are people protesting in favor of the demons of Hamas. This is unbelievable, the fracturing of our country. So in one aspect, we couldn't do it again because there is no unity. After 9/11, there was unity for what, a couple of weeks? After we got hit, 9/11, 2001, and then what? We went right back to our sniping at each other. Even after we got attacked for the second time, we couldn't keep it together. But in another respect, people say, do we have men who could do this anymore? Well, now we have men and women. Our military fought nobly, gallantly for 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, where people did things that you could never even fathom. The Army Rangers who climbed the cliffs at Normandy, the cliffs at Omaha Beach, the cliffs at Utah Beach, those Army Rangers still exist today. And two of them can walk into a village and turn that village into a fighting force to repel the Iraqi or Afghanistan bad guys. We absolutely still have a remnant of what we had before, but we can be lazy now because our technology, as the Ukrainians have shown, all they needed is our stuff to repel the Russians. They didn't even need us. They just needed our weapons. We've gotten so good at war with so much technology that we can sit home fat, dumb, and happy like King David while our war fighters are out there pulling triggers and going through psychological and physical trauma. This is a difficult thing to get our heads around because it's surreal. You watch it on YouTube and I listened to these war fighters get interviewed and the things that they had to do, and you could turn it into like a fiction. You could think that it's a movie and it's not real, but it is real. But when we landed at Normandy, we were going to Berlin. We weren't going anywhere but Berlin. We were not going to get up to Belgium and then start peace treaties with Hitler. We weren't there to have a conversation. This idea that after Israel was attacked on October the 7th, that somehow they should have a negotiated peace with the tiny country that allowed 1,000 demons to parasail into their country for the sole purpose of raping, kidnapping, and murdering, pillaging, like a bunch of absolute demons. that somehow we're going to negotiate with the people who spent 3 years planning such an atrocity. That's unfathomable. No, just no. When our men landed at Normandy, they killed absolutely everything in their path that didn't immediately surrender. And they came home like men and didn't talk about it. They did what they had to do. There weren't a lot of civilians left to kill because Hitler had done it on his way to the coast. But no, they blew up churches. They blew up hospitals. They hit everything. They bombed the snot out of Germany with reckless abandon because they were going to kill the dictator and end the evil. And you know what? In the end of days, when the Messiah comes back, that's how he's coming back. That's a terrifying reality. This victory brought about a freedom and security for the Western world that allowed us to develop a common civilization from Norway and Sweden down to the Horn of Italy, down to Paraguay, to the United States. We have had 80 years of prosperity and peace. Even though there's been wars, overall, it's been great. As I speak right now, the men's championship of French Open tennis is happening in Paris, the same place that we had to liberate 80 years ago. And there are people who are playing from countries all over the place. You're looking at these flags, and I'm having to look up people on my phone to find out where country is that one from? Where's that one from? People from all over the world can get on a jet and go and have a career playing tennis. Well, in D-Day, stars, wealthy people, Elvis Presley, Ernest Borgnine, people gave up their careers, their lucrative jobs, and they went and they fought. So today, you can have a lucrative career playing a game against somebody who lives 1,000,000 miles from you. We have this freedom, except it's gone to our heads. We had a very famous reporter named Daniel Pearl, who was an American Jew, decided it was a good idea to go and have an interview in secret with the Taliban, and he paid it for it with his life. That was in the 2010s, I believe. Today, we have journalists who think, I'm a journalist. I have a journalism degree, so I'm going to go to Russia, even though our State Department said every American get out of Russia, and that man is going to be in jail for a very long time. Because Russia is not us. And the Taliban are not us. But when you grow up in this freedom and this liberty that we have, you tend to take it for granted because you don't know anything different. And a lot of times when people learn different, they learn it the hard way. There's atrocity of some youngsters from Missouri who went to Haiti as missionaries and end up coming home and having to be buried by their parents. Completely atrocious. And they martyred. And they were over there trying to spread the gospel and do some good. But we have to realize that when we leave the peace and security of Canada, the United States, Great Britain, France, and when we leave Australia, we leave New Zealand, we're no longer in those places. We are in dangerous lands. So to tie this into the Bible, Israel was faithful when they entered Canaan. When they crossed the Jordan, aside for some hiccups, they stayed unified and on mission until the land was apportioned. From the Exodus until the end of Joshua, Israel was established as a humongous military power with Yahweh at the helm. And they peaked. They peaked at the end of the book of Joshua and began a decline that resulted in desolation, 2 desolations. They got restored after Babylon. They found their resolve in repelling the Greeks. And they existed while being occupied for the first coming of Yeshua. Our nation has similar patterns. We have peaked. D-Day 80 years ago was our peak. It was a good peak. And we have been in decline ever since. We survived the bloodiest civil war to end slavery. We threw off the British Empire. We liberated Europe in World War I. And then we defeated the Nazis with our masculinity our bravery and unity while also defeating Tojo's Japan with our technology in the most horrific fashion. That was our peak. We were unified. The men came home, and there were conversations that needed to be had. Like, if a black man can serve and die in Europe, how come a black man not use the same water fountain as a white man back in the United States? We had to solve that problem too. Women went into the workforce in a huge way and applied their organizational skills from the home in industry. And they didn't. Some of them went back to being housewives, but a lot of them didn't. We had a lot of changes, some for the good, some for the bad. Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. On September 2, 1945, World War II ended when U.S. General Douglas MacArthur accepted Japan's formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri. And that ended a conflict that had claimed between 60 to 80 million lives, 3% of Earth's population. Lord knows how many munitions, how much fuel, how much pollution, how much death. After the conquest of Canaan, it is written that every man went and did what was right in his own eyes. And that started the long slide. And after World War I, World War II, we did the same exact thing. We gave up that unity of purpose. We gave up the one nation under God. We gave up our sense of duty and honor so that every man could come home and do what was right in his own eyes. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody was evil. Even when Israel was doing what was right in its own eyes, Yahweh produced 7,000 men who had not bowed the knee to Baal. Because what was right in those men's eyes was following Yahweh. Same with us. We're blessed with this liberty to do what's right in our own eyes. And what's right in my own eyes is to read the word of God and do it. And so we do it. So there's a remnant, and the remnant are the people who choose to do right. But the people who choose to do wrong almost always outweigh the ones that choose to do right. And then we get wake-up calls where people straighten up for a little bit. The disunity that began after Canaan is very similar to the disunity that began after World War II. And I don't have a solution, but I did want to offer my perspective on these events and things for us to all contemplate as we see our society continuing to change. And we all must pray Yahweh's will be done, but that people who see what's right in their own eyes will actually wake up and look at the Bible and realize that they need to get right with Yahweh and Yeshua before Yeshua returns. Thank you. And again, visit firstcenturychristianity.net if you want to join live, 1 p.m. Central Time. And may Yahweh bless you and keep you in the name of his son, Yeshua.